Hello, and welcome to this brand new Blender Smoothie tutorial. My name is Ben Amond, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to create these clouds in Blender. Now this is a really quick and easy setup, so it only takes probably once you know how to do it less than 2 minutes sometimes to set it up. I guess it may depend on where the horizon in your image is and everything like that. But note that while it does take a really short amount of time to set up, it does have really, really long render times. So that's something to be aware of when you're working with this. But it's a technique that'll help you learn, hopefully, a little bit more, oops, bumped the microphone, about the cycles, volume shaders, and the way they interact with textures. And also, sometimes it's kind of fun to create a sky completely from scratch, so you can say you created everything in the scene without using a sky image texture as a background, and that's kind of enjoyable too. So let's get started. I'm just going to press Control-N and reload the startup file there. Okay, I'm going to start out by deleting this lamp because we're going to be adding our own lamp again later, as usual. I'm going to scale this up a lot too, this box that we have right here. Something like that. It doesn't really matter too much. And I'm actually going to press SZ to scale it along the Z-axis. We're going to scale it down to something like that, about that thickness. Now here's something to keep in mind when you're scaling the box. Basically we're going to be adding this volume shader to the entire cube and then cutting away parts of it with a noise texture to create the cloud shapes. The shorter the box is, then the more flattened the clouds will look. So if you have it something like this, then the clouds will look somewhat flat. They won't look completely two-dimensional, but they won't look nearly as tall as they would if the cube was the normal size, or the normal height, I should say. So we want to scale it down along the z-axis because we want to compress these a little bit. Otherwise it doesn't look very natural because you expect a certain level of flatness, especially when you're looking up at the clouds, and especially as they get closer to the horizon. But you don't want it too thin because you don't want them looking two-dimensional. So we want to try maybe something right about there. Will probably work pretty well. And I'm actually going to move that, press GZ to move it up above the grid. Alright, and I'm going to position my camera before I go any farther. So I'm in front view right now, which is 1 on the number pad. I'm going to zoom in with my mouse wheel and press Control-Alt-0. And that just puts the camera in our current view. And then you can just sort of position the camera from there. Just press G, click the middle mouse button to kind of move it back and forth like that, and then otherwise you can just press G to move it around like that. Rotate it along the x-axis, RX, just sort of angle it up a little bit more maybe. Then we can kind of keep manipulating it here. Maybe rotate it up even more. Something like that. And I'm not going to spend too much time getting this all figured out. Let's see, how's that? That's pretty good. I'm actually going to scale out that cube a little bit too, pressing S, just so we don't have those areas in the corner there. That'll probably work pretty well. We can always reposition the camera later. So before we go any farther, I am going to press Shift-A and add a plane. Press G to sort of move it over here. This is going to be our sun lamp. I'm going to scale it down a little bit too so we can get some sharper shadows. And I'm going to move it out pretty far, maybe somewhere over there, and also over here a little bit, and I'm just going to press R to rotate that a tiny bit so that it's facing that direction. That's pretty good. Okay. So from here, let's kind of start working on the lighting. And in the case of clouds, typically what you would want to do is you would want to come over here to the World button, click the Use Nodes option, so we can use nodes for the world shader. And I'm going to split my view just by hovering over these little diagonal lines up here and clicking and dragging down. And I'm going to change this window from the 3D view to the node editor. And I'm going to go ahead and add, nope, I have the lamp selected. So when you're in this node editor, you want to make sure that you have this Earth icon selected instead of the orange cube icon selected, because the orange cube icon If we were to add a new shader for that now, that would give us a new shader for this plane right here, the sun that we set aside. So we want to add a shader to the world first, or tweak this at least. And what we want to do basically is press Shift-A, hover over texture, and add a sky texture. And this does exactly what it says it does, really. I mean, if we go into rendered view, we can see that we've now got sort of a sky going on there. If we go into the camera view and then right-click our cube, press H to hide it, we get that, which it looks pretty good. It could probably be a little brighter. Let's see, does adjusting the strength of the sky, that helps a little bit. So we'll maybe make that about 1.2, maybe 1.15, make it a little darker. What we're doing there is adjusting the strength, which basically increases the brightness of the sky. You want to be careful, though, when you're adjusting that, because if you make it too bright, then it'll also make the shadows of the clouds really bright as well. So you want to find that balance between those. And that's probably pretty good. Right now, I believe, and you can sort of click and drag this sphere around, the light of this sphere around to kind of adjust the time of day. I think this is pretty good for what we have. I think when it's just over the center like that, it's pretty much a midday kind of look, which is really what we're going for. Okay, so I won't combine these just yet. I'm going to move this out of the way, though, and I'm going to press Alt-H. Oops. Hover over the 3D viewport, press Alt-H to unhide this cube. And now we should be able to start working on the cloud shader. Alright, so to do this, I'm just going to bring this back down a little bit. And remember, to add a shader to the object, you want to go back to that cube right there, that cube icon. And we're going to start working with this a little bit before we add a shader to our sun lamp, just so we can get the brightness right. So I'm going to click Use Nodes. And we're just going to delete this diffuse shader, because we don't need that for anything. We're going to press Shift-A, hover over Shader, and choose Volume Scatter. And drop that volume output into the volume input on the material output node. And we're going to make this bright white. Now what we can do from here is adjust this anisotropic factor right there. And we'll probably be doing that a little bit later. Basically, that sort of adjusts the way the light scatters through the volume or around the volume. And it can really help sell the effect of a cloud if you have the right value inserted, or a good enough value. So right now, all we have is, if I go into rendered view here, this giant volumetric cube, which doesn't look anything like a cloud, of course. So what we've got to do now is we've got to sort of cut out the shape. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to add a mix shader, Shift-A, add a mix shader. And I'm going to also add a transparent shader. And I'm going to plug that into the second input of the mix shader. So this is what we've got here. We're sort of combining the volumetric, or the volume scatter shader, and the transparent shader. And right now it would just give us half and half of both of them, which is what this little factor thing does. So if we want to use a texture to sort of cut out shapes, then we want to plug the texture into that factor input. So I'm going to press Shift-A and add a noise texture and drop that color input into the factor input. Now, if we were to render it now, we still wouldn't notice too much of a difference. We might notice a little bit. But the reason we're not noticing is partially because we have to adjust the scale. Right now it's kind of large, so that will make it kind of hard to see in some parts, because we might get some giant parts where there's only volumetric material and some parts where there's nothing. Alright, and the other thing is we need to bring up the contrast of this texture, because right now it is really low in contrast. So I'm just going to press Shift-A and add color RGB curves. And then you can just sort of click in the middle of this line to create a new point. And I'm going to drag this up to right about there. And then click there to add another point and drag this right about down there. Now basically what we're doing, like I said before, is we're adding contrast. The closer these 2 points that we added are together, then the sharper the contrast is going to be. And also the sharper the edges of the clouds are going to be as a result of that. And basically the farther to the left these are, I'm fairly certain, then the less cloud there is and the more transparency there is. And the farther to the right these points are, then the more cloud and less transparency there is. So we want to put it somewhere right about there. That's a little more transparency than cloud, and that should work pretty well. I'm going to save this before we go any farther because I don't want it to crash on me. Let's call it. All right. And we might as well go ahead and try to start working out a good shader for our sun lamp here. So I just right-clicked that to select it. And we're just going to add a new shader. Delete that diffuse one, press Shift-A, and add an emission shader, because this is, of course, emitting light since it's the sun. And I'm going to give this a slight yellow tint in addition to bringing this slider all the way up to white. And I'm going to bring up the strength to something like, I don't know, 35,000 to begin with. We'll see how that goes. We'll see if we can sort of... Alright, so now we can see we've got some really nice shapes going on in there. So you can actually see the way the texture is sort of working at eating away those parts of the cloud. I'm actually going to adjust that factor right here, the anisotropy, I have no clue how to say it, can't remember. But let's see here, we want to bring this up to 0.5, maybe to start with. Okay, and right off the bat we can see that that does a lot from the way the light scatters from inside the volumetric parts. So, it looks a lot more cloud-like, at least on the right. For some reason that's not carrying over too well on the left. Might be because the clouds are a little more dense there. Something else I want to do, though, before we go any farther, is sort of adjust the scale. If we bring this up to something like 12, then we've got the clouds are a lot more compact, a lot closer together, and it looks kind of more like a sort of patchy, overcast kind of day. We also want to bring up this detail to like 20. We really want to enhance that. We won't really notice much of a difference right here in the preview since it's such a low resolution image. But once we finally do the final render, then it'll be noticeable and it'll look a lot better because of that. I'm also going to distort these a little bit, so we'll give this a little bit of distortion, maybe 0.5. And what that does is it basically kind of twists around the noise texture a little bit to give it a little distortion. It looks a little better that way, I think. Alright, we're still getting a lot more light on the right side than we are on the left, which is good to a certain extent, because it kind of makes it look like the sun is right behind that patch of clouds. So to give at least a little bit of direction to the light is a good thing, but it's a little too much. So I'm going to press Z to leave this rendered view. And I'm just going to move this over a little bit so that it's kind of more centered, and then sort of rotate it so that it's facing that properly. Move it back a little more. We'll see how that looks. Hopefully that's a little more centered. That's a lot better. Might be too bright now, though. We'll see. Now, instead of waiting for this whole thing to render out in the preview, I'm just going to press Z to go back into solid view here. And I'm going to press Shift-B. Basically what this does is if you're in the camera view, you can drag a box around a section that you would like to preview render. So I'm going to press Shift-B and drag a box around that, which means when you render the image, it'll only render that little section of it. So it's really good for previewing certain areas. So I'm just going to select a little section like that. I'm going to come over here to the render settings, scroll down to sampling, and we'll try 10 samples to start with. And I'm just going to click render, and we'll sort of see how this looks. So it's a really handy feature to use. And it looks like it's not too bright from what I can tell. You do want, honestly, if you're trying to make a realistic looking sky, you do want a little bit of overexposure in some parts, because it really helps sell the effect, especially if whatever is beneath the sky that you're working on is at a fairly normal exposure, then you would expect the sky to be slightly overexposed. So that's always a nice touch to add a little more realism to it. But that looks pretty good. Yeah. Might do with maybe a slightly smaller size to scale that out a little bit. It's kind of counterintuitive because the larger the size of the texture is, the more closely packed the clouds are. But the smaller the size is, then the more spread out and the larger they are. So I'm going to lower the size, I think, to make them spread out a little bit more. I'm going to select that again, and maybe we'll lower it to something like 10. And I also want a little more transparency than we have right now. So I'm going to move this even farther over to the left a bit, maybe something like that. Click and drag that over. Remember, the closer those 2 points are to each other, then the sharper the contrast is. And I think I'm going to render that little previewed area again. Yeah, so you see when we move those over to the left, then we got a little more transparency than we did cloud. So just keep that in mind. It also depends on what order, of course, these are mixed in. If we plug the transparent shader into the first input and the volume scatter into the second input instead, then it would be the reverse. So whatever order you plug them into the mixed shader, and just keep that in mind. And that looks pretty good. Yeah. So maybe we can try a full render at this point just to see how the entire thing looks. I'm going to press escape to get out of that. Oops. Sort of go over that. Alright, and I'm going to render this whole thing, and I'm going to pause the recording so that you don't have to sit around and wait for it. Because that's the thing that I can't remember if I mentioned towards the beginning, that again, it is relatively easy to set up. This is a really quick setup once you know how to do it, but it can increase your render times by quite a bit. So, alright, let's render this. Hello, welcome back. And here is the final image, the final render. And it looks pretty good. Fairly happy with it. You can see that sort of since we used the cube, then we can kind of see some darker, fainter clouds. And I think those are some of the ones that are kind of on the opposite side of the cube, or farther into the cube that aren't right there at the bottom. So that adds some layers of depth to it, which is really, really nice. And that's pretty much it for this technique. You can even complicate it farther and add a little more detail to it by adding like a separate noise texture and mixing this right here with another transparent shader, so that you could have sort of some larger areas with no clouds, and then the smaller areas that did have clouds would also have sub-areas without clouds. And you could sort of mess with the scattering of the clouds in that way too. But I find that this method is really useful. So, yeah, that's it. I hope you learned something from this tutorial. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.